My husband slapped my 8-year-old son in front of his mistress because he called her auntie instead of My son ran to his room and didn't come out for 2 days. I didn't confront my husband. I installed a tiny camera in the living room. What it recorded over the next 30 days. His lawyer begged me not to release. The sound of the slap was so loud it bounced off every wall in the living room. My 8-year-old son Beckett had walked out of the kitchen holding a juice box, looked at the woman sitting on my couch with her shoes off like she owned the place and said, "Hi, Aunty Diane." My husband, Troy Calloway, stood up from his recliner so fast the remote hit the floor. He grabbed Beckett by the arm, yanked him forward, and slapped him across the face hard enough that Beckett's glasses flew off and landed on the carpet near the woman's bare feet. "Her name is Mom," Troy said, his voice flat and dead like he was correcting a spelling error. "You call her Mom. My name is Harper Ellison Calloway. I'm 26 years old." I was standing in the hallway just 4 feet from the living room entrance, holding a basket of folded laundry. I saw the whole thing. I saw Beckett's face go white then red. I saw the juice box hit the floor and spill across the rug. I saw Diane cross her legs and look away, not shocked, not sorry, bored. Like she'd seen this before. Like it wasn't her problem. Beckett didn't cry. That was the part that split something open inside me. He didn't cry. He picked up his glasses with both hands, put them back on crooked and walked past me down the hallway without looking up. I heard his bedroom door close. Not slam. Close. Quietly. Like a kid who had already learned that noise gets you hurt. He didn't come out for 2 days. I brought him meals on a tray. PB&J with the crusts cut off, apple slices, a carton of chocolate milk. He ate a little. He didn't talk. He sat on his bed with his knees pulled up and his sketchbook open, drawing the same thing over and over. A house with no door. I didn't confront Troy. I didn't scream. I didn't pack a bag. I know that sounds wrong. I know some of you are already thinking, why didn't she leave right then? And I'll tell you why. Because I'd tried leaving before 14 months earlier, and Troy had emptied our joint account, $43,000, into a trust one couldn't touch and told me if I took Beckett, he'd have me arrested for kidnapping. His cousin was a family court clerk in Macon County. He wasn't bluffing. He'd done it to his first wife. So I did something else. I drove to a Best Buy 32 miles from our house, paid $129 in cash for a motion-activated camera the size of a thumb drive, and installed it behind the books on the living room shelf while Troy was at the gym. The tiny green light was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. What it recorded over the next 30 days made Troy's own lawyer, a man who had defended 3 state senators and a sitting judge, beg me on his knees in a conference room not to release the footage. Before I go any further, if this story is already hitting somewhere real for you, hit that like button and subscribe. I read every single comment. Drop where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know who's with me right now. Let me take you back 3 years before any of this started. I met Troy Calloway when I was 22 at a fundraiser for the Children's Literacy Foundation I worked for in Decatur, Georgia. I was the youngest program coordinator they'd ever hired. I ran after-school reading workshops in 4 different elementary schools, trained volunteers, wrote the quarterly grants. I made $38,500 a year and I was proud of every dollar because I'd earned it with a degree from Kennesaw State that I'd paid for myself, working nights at a veterinary clinic while carrying a full course load for 3.5 years. Troy was 41. A commercial real estate developer. He showed up to the fundraiser in a navy suit with a watch that probably cost more than my car, wrote a $10,000 check to the foundation, and asked me to dinner before the speeches started. He smelled like cedar and money and certainty. I should have heard the alarm bells. A 41-year-old man pursuing a 22-year-old woman isn't flattering. It's selection. He wasn't looking for a partner. He was looking for someone young enough to be shaped. But I didn't hear the bells. I heard the compliments. He told me my work mattered. He told me I was the smartest person at the table. He told me his first marriage had ended because his ex-wife couldn't handle ambition. I believed every word. I wanted to believe every word, and that's the part I've had to forgive myself for. We married 11 months later at a courthouse in Savannah. His idea. He said big weddings were wasteful. My mother drove 3 hours from Macon and sat in the hallway because Troy said the ceremony room only allowed 4 guests. It allowed 30. I found that out 2 years later when I went back to the courthouse for a records request and the clerk said, "Oh honey, that room fits a whole congregation." What I didn't know was that his first wife had gotten a favorable settlement partly because their wedding guest had testified about his controlling behavior during the reception. Troy didn't want witnesses this time. He'd learned from his mistakes. That was the most dangerous thing about him, he was always learning. The first time he made me feel small was 6 weeks after the wedding. I came home excited because the foundation had approved my proposal to expand our reading program into 2 rural counties, Jasper and Putnam. I'd worked on that proposal for 5 months. Stayed late 17 nights in a row. My supervisor had called it the strongest grant application the foundation had ever submitted. I walked in the door talking fast, holding the approval letter, and Troy looked up from his laptop and said, "That's nice. So you're going to spend even more time babysitting other people's kids for 38 grand. He went back to his screen. Didn't look up again. I stood there with the letter in my hand for probably 10 seconds. Then I folded it, put it in my bag, and went to the kitchen to start dinner. I peeled 3 potatoes before I realized I was peeling the same one twice because my hands wouldn't stop moving. That was the first time. Not the last. The second time was worse because it happened in front of someone else. 4 months after the wedding, Troy's business partner Wade Donnelly came over for dinner with his wife, Phoebe. I'd made roasted chicken, a tomato salad, cornbread from my grandmother's recipe. When I brought the food out, Troy said, not quietly, not under his breath, but at full volume across the dining table, "Harper likes to pretend she's Martha Stewart. It distracts her from the fact that she makes less than my accountant's assistant." Wade laughed. Phoebe looked at her plate. I smiled because what else do you do when the ground opens up under you at your own table? 7 months later, I found out I was pregnant with Beckett. Troy didn't want children. He told me that on our 3rd date, and I told him I did, and he'd said, "We'll figure it out." What he meant was, "You'll figure out that I'm not negotiating." When I showed him the positive test, he stared at it for 4 seconds and said, "Well, I guess we'll need a bigger tax deduction." He never called Beckett by his name for the first 3 months. He called him, the baby, or your project. Once, when Beckett was 6 weeks old and I was up at 3 a.m. with a crying infant while Troy slept in the guest room with the door locked, I sat in the rocking chair and whispered to my son, "I will never let you feel like you don't belong here." I meant it. I just didn't know yet how much that promise would cost. The woman I was before Troy would have fought. But Troy had a way of making you feel like fighting was the thing that proved you were wrong. If you got upset, you were emotional. If you asked questions, you were insecure. If you set a boundary, you were controlling. He had a phrase he used at least twice a week. It was his signature, his weapon, the sentence that could end any conversation. "You know what your problem is, Harper? You think your feelings are facts." He said it the way someone comments on the weather. Casual. Certain. Like he was describing something everyone else could already see. Diane Whitfield entered the picture when Beckett was 5. I found out the way most women find out, not through a confession but through a receipt. A $4,200 charge at a jewelry store in Buckhead, dated the day before my birthday. I didn't get jewelry for my birthday. I got a $75 gift card to a spa in a strip mall. The gift card still had the CVS price sticker on the back. He hadn't even peeled it off. I didn't say anything. I couldn't afford to. By then, Troy had moved all our finances into accounts under his name. My access was a joint checking account. He deposited $2,200 into every month for groceries, gas, and Beckett school supplies. If I spent more than that, I had to explain why. I had a spreadsheet he reviewed every 2 weeks. Once he circled a $14 charge at a Wendy's and wrote in red pen, "Explain. The person you need to know about, and you won't understand why until later, is Troy's mother, Laureen Calloway. She was 73, quiet, always sitting in the corner at family gatherings with her reading glasses on, working through a crossword puzzle or knitting something small that never seemed to become anything finished. She never said much. Troy dismissed her openly, called her the ghost behind her back, said she'd gone soft after his father died. At one Thanksgiving, Troy told a table of 12 people that his mother hadn't had an original thought since 1998. Laureen was sitting right there. She didn't react. She just filled in another crossword square and took a sip of her tea. She came to our house every other Sunday for dinner. She'd sit with Beckett at the kitchen table, help him with his drawings, ask him about school, listen to him talk about the books he was reading. She'd leave without saying more than 12 words to Troy. I thought she was just tired. I thought she was just old and fading. I thought the silence was surrender. I was wrong about Lorene. Completely entirely wrong. But that part comes later. 19 days after I installed the camera, I plugged the thumb drive into my laptop at 2 a.m. while Troy was asleep in the guest room. He'd stopped sleeping in our bed 8 months earlier, didn't even pretend anymore. The house was dark except for the blue glow of my screen. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the tick of the hallway clock my mother had given us as a wedding gift. Troy had wanted to throw it out. I'd kept it. Some things you keep just to prove you still can. I expected to find evidence of an affair. Diane on the couch. Troy performing for her. Enough to establish infidelity in a Georgia divorce filing. What I found was worse. The camera had captured 31 separate incidents. Troy yelling at Beckett for leaving a cup on the counter. Troy grabbing Beckett's arm hard enough to leave a mark I'd noticed but believed was from the playground. A bruise the size of a quarter on his left forearm that I'd kissed and put ice on while Troy watched from the doorway without saying a word. Troy telling Beckett on camera in clear audio, "If you tell your mother anything that happens in this house when she's not here, I'll send her away and you'll never see her again." I watched that recording and I understood in my bones why my son had stopped talking at dinner. Why he flinched when Troy opened a cabinet too fast. Why he drew houses with no doors. He wasn't being quiet. He was being obedient. He was protecting me the only way an 8-year-old knows how, by keeping a secret that was too heavy for his hands. But the recording that made my hands stop working, the one that made me sit on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m. with my laptop balanced on the edge of the tub, was from day 23. Diane was on the couch. Troy was standing over Beckett, who was sitting on the floor doing homework. And Diane said, "Troy, just sign the papers. Once you get full custody we can put him in that boarding school in Virginia. He'll be out of our hair by September." Troy nodded. "Already talked to Gerald about it. He says if we can prove Harper's unfit, her work schedule, those nights she was out for the literacy events, it'll take about 6 weeks." Gerald. Troy's lawyer. Gerald Doss. The man who had billed Troy $47,000 in the past year alone, according to a bank statement I found in Troy's desk drawer 3 days later. The man who had sat in my house, eaten my food at 2 Thanksgivings, shaken my hand, and was now plotting to take my child by weaponizing the job I loved. The same job my own husband had spent 4 years calling worthless. They were planning to take my son. Not because Troy wanted Beckett. Because Beckett was in the way. And the fastest way to remove me was to prove I was an absent mother, using the exact same job Troy had belittled for 4 years. The cruelty of it was so precise it almost felt designed. And I suppose it was. I didn't cry. I think I was past crying by then. I sat there on that cold tile floor and felt something shift in my chest like a bone resetting. Not anger. Clarity. The kind you get when you realize you've been playing a game you didn't know existed, and now you can finally see the board. I poured myself a glass of water from the bathroom sink. I didn't drink it. I just held it and watched the surface shake from the trembling I couldn't stop. A strand of hair had fallen across my face and I didn't push it back. I just sat there holding a glass of water I'd never drink, looking at my own reflection in the dark window above the tub. Then I opened a new folder on my laptop and named it Proof. Over the next 11 days I did not change a single thing about my routine. I made breakfast at 6:45. I drove Beckett to Pine Ridge Elementary at 7:30. I went to work at the foundation. I was now assistant director, a promotion Troy didn't know about because he'd stopped asking about my job 2 years earlier. I came home, cooked dinner, cleaned the kitchen, read Beckett a story and went to bed. But between the ordinary hours I was building something. I copied every recording onto 3 separate drives. I stored one in my desk at work inside a manila folder labeled Q3 Grant Reports. Because no one at the foundation would ever open that folder and neither would Troy if he ever went looking. One in a safe deposit box at a bank in Covington, 26 miles from our house, that I opened with my maiden name. The third I gave to the one person I trusted more than anyone else in my life. My college roommate Nadia Okafor, who was now a paralegal at a family law firm in Atlanta. Nadia didn't just hold the drive. She watched every recording. All 31 of them in order over the course of one evening. Then she called me at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday and said 5 words, "Harper, this is a case." She connected me with her firm's senior partner, a woman named Deborah Price Whitman, who had won custody reversals in 11 Georgia counties. I met her on my lunch break in a Panera Bread parking lot because I couldn't risk being seen at a law firm. She reviewed the footage on her laptop in the passenger seat of my car in 14 minutes and said, "We're filing Monday." I asked her to wait. Not because I wasn't ready. Because there was one more thing I needed. There was a night during that preparation period, day 9 I think, when I almost stopped everything. Beckett had a nightmare. He came into my room at 2 a.m. and climbed into my bed and pressed his face against my shoulder and said, "Mommy, are we going to be okay?" I held him and said yes. But after he fell asleep, I lay there in the dark with his breath warm on my collarbone, and I thought about what would happen if I was wrong. If the footage wasn't enough. If Troy's connections got him out of it. If I lost Beckett trying to save him. My hands started shaking again. I pressed them flat against the mattress and counted to 60, and somewhere around 43, the fear loosened just enough for me to breathe. Troy had a family dinner planned for April 12th. His birthday. He'd invited 14 people to the house. His business partners, Diane, a few cousins. He was planning to announce that he and Diane were officially together, and that he'd be filing for divorce on his terms. Diane had told him to do it publicly in front of people so I couldn't make a scene. I knew this because I had it on camera. Day 28. Diane sitting on the couch, legs crossed, filing her nails, saying, "Just do it at the party, Troy. She won't fight if there are witnesses. She never does." She was right about one thing. I never had fought. Not once in 4 years. But she was wrong about April 12th. Hold on, I need to ask you something before this next part. Has someone in your own family ever made you feel invisible? Like no matter what you built, what you gave, what you sacrificed, it just wasn't enough for them? Write it in the comments. I want to read it. And hit that like button. Let me know you're still here with me. Troy's birthday dinner was at 7 p.m. on a Saturday. He'd ordered catering from a steakhouse in Buckhead, $2,800 for 14 people. Filet mignon, lobster tails, roasted asparagus, a 3-tier chocolate cake with his initials on top. The dining table had been extended with a leaf we'd never used. The house smelled like garlic butter and expensive cologne. Troy had put on a playlist. Jazz, something smooth and confident, the kind of music people play when they want the room to feel like a magazine. I wore a gray dress I'd bought at Target for $24. I did my hair. I put on the pearl earrings my grandmother had given me when I graduated from Kennesaw State. The same earrings I'd worn to my courthouse wedding, the same ones I'd worn the day Beckett was born. They were the only jewelry I owned that Troy hadn't picked out. I looked like exactly what Troy expected me to look like. Quiet, presentable, and already defeated. The guests arrived between 6:30 and 7:15. Troy's business partner, Wade Donnelly, and his wife Phoebe. 2 of Troy's cousins from Macon. Loud men who laughed at everything Troy said and never asked me a single question. 3 couples from his real estate circle whose names I barely knew because Troy had never bothered to introduce me properly at events. And Diane, who walked in at 7:10 wearing a red dress and heels, carrying a gift bag with tissue paper spilling from the top, and kissing Troy on the cheek in front of everyone like it was the most natural thing in the world. No one looked at me. Not one person in that room made eye contact with me. I was furniture. I was the gray dress in the corner of a room full of people who had already agreed on a version of events that didn't include me. Troy gave a toast at 7:45. He stood at the head of the table with a glass of bourbon, the overhead light catching his watch, the same watch he'd been wearing the night he met me, and said he had an important announcement about the next chapter. He looked at Diane. She smiled and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, already rehearsing the role. He said he and I had grown apart, that it was mutual and amicable, and that he'd be moving forward with someone who understood partnership. He actually used that word. Partnership. The man who'd reviewed my grocery receipts for 4 years and circled a $14 charge at a Wendy's. Then he said, "Harper and I will be handling the transition privately, and I appreciate everyone's support as we navigate this." 14 people raised their glasses. Diane touched his arm. Someone said, "Congratulations." I don't know who. It didn't matter. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I was still sitting in the chair at the far end of the table, my hands folded in my lap, watching. Troy looked at me. I think he expected tears or maybe a nod, some kind of submission he could point to later as agreement. Instead, he saw something he hadn't seen before. My face was calm. Completely calm. And that unsettled him because in 4 years of marriage, I had never once been calm during a confrontation. I had always been the one who shook, who blinked first, who folded. Not tonight. He said, Harper, anything you'd like to add? I said, actually yes. And then the doorbell rang. Laureen Calloway, Troy's 73-year-old mother, the woman he called the ghost, walked through the front door holding a manila envelope and a portable speaker. She was not invited to this dinner. Troy hadn't invited his own mother to his birthday party. He told me she was too fragile for social events. Laureen did not look fragile. She walked into that dining room like she'd been waiting for this night for years. Behind her, holding a laptop bag, was Nadia Okafor, my college roommate, my paralegal, the woman who had held a thumb drive for 11 days without telling a soul. She nodded at me once. Just once. That was all I needed. Laureen set a portable speaker on the table next to the catered steak. She looked at Troy and said, "Sit down, son." Troy didn't sit. But he stopped talking, and for the first time in my marriage I watched the color leave his face. 3 weeks ago, Laureen said, her voice steady as stone, Harper called me. She told me what you've been doing to my grandson. He showed me the footage. I watched every second. All 31 recordings. I watched you grab an 8-year-old boy by the arm. I watched you threaten him. I watched you tell him that if he spoke to his mother, you'd make her disappear. The room was silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that has weight. Wade Donnelly put his fork down. His wife, Phoebe, pressed her napkin against her mouth. One of Troy's cousins from Macon pushed his chair back 2 inches, like he was already calculating the distance to the front door. And Diane's smile collapsed in slow motion, like a house with a cracked foundation finally giving way. Nadia opened the laptop. She pressed play. The audio filled the room. Troy's voice, clear as church bells, sang to Beckett, "If you tell your mother anything that happens in this house when she's not here, I'll send her away and you'll never see her again." The sound of a child breathing. Then nothing. Nadia pressed stop. No one moved. Laureen opened the manila envelope and pulled out a single document. "This," she said, "is a notarized letter from me, witnessed by 2 attorneys, confirming that I have viewed 31 recorded incidents of emotional abuse and physical intimidation of a minor in this household. It also confirms that the real estate holding company registered under your name, Callaway Creek Ventures, was capitalized entirely with $620,000 from your father's estate. Money that was left to me. Money I loaned you in 2019 with a signed repayment agreement you have never honored." She placed the paper on the table between the bread basket and a vase of hydrangeas. "I'm calling the loan. All of it. Effective immediately." Troy grabbed the edge of the table. His knuckles went white. $620,000 came out of his mouth like he was hearing the number for the first time, even though he'd spent every dollar of it building the business he used to make himself feel important. "And this," Laureen continued, pulling a second paper from the envelope, "is a formal complaint filed this morning with the Georgia State Bar against Gerald Doss for conspiring to fabricate evidence of parental unfitness. Nadia Okafor's firm filed it. It includes time-stamped video of your lawyer discussing strategy with your girlfriend in my grandson's living room. Gerald Doss. The man Troy had paid $47,000 to protect him. The man who had sat in that same living room and planned how to take Beckett away from me. His law license was now on the table next to the garlic butter and the $2,800 worth of steak." Diane stood up. She grabbed her purse. Troy looked at her and said, "Where are you going?" She didn't answer. She walked out the front door in her red dress and heels, and the door didn't slam. It clicked shut. The same quiet sound Beckett's door had made 30 days ago. The sound of someone leaving a room they know they're never coming back to. Troy turned to me. His face was the color of old paper. His jaw was working but nothing was coming out, just this small, grinding motion like a man chewing on something he couldn't swallow. His hands were flat on the table. The bourbon glass was still next to his plate, untouched since Laureen had walked in. For the first time in 4 years, Troy Calloway had no sentence, no phrase, no weapon. The man who always had the last word was standing in a room full of people and couldn't find a single one. Wade Donnelly stood up quietly, took his wife's hand and walked toward the front door without saying goodbye. One of the Macon cousins followed. Then the other. The couples from the real estate circle. People who had raised their glasses 30 seconds after Troy announced the end of my marriage, picked up their coats and moved toward the exit in a kind of slow, embarrassed procession. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked at Troy. The $2,800 steak was getting cold on the table. I stood up from my chair. I looked at him across the table, past the catered food, past the bourbon, past the 3-tier chocolate cake with his initials on top, past the empty chairs where 14 guests had been sitting in complete silence, witnessing the exact opposite of what they'd been invited to see. I said, "You told me my feelings weren't facts. But those recordings are. And now everyone in this room knows it." I picked up my purse. I walked out of the dining room. I went upstairs, picked up Beckett, who was asleep in his bed with his sketchbook open to a new drawing, a house with a bright red door, and I carried him to my car. He was heavy. Heavier than the last time I'd carried him, which had been months ago. He was growing. That thought hit me in the driveway and I almost lost it right there, standing next to the car with my son in my arms and the night air cool on my face. He was growing and I was going to be there for all of it. We drove to Nadia's apartment in Atlanta. Beckett slept the entire way, 43 minutes on I-20 with the city lights getting brighter through the windshield. I kept one hand on the wheel and one hand on his knee, and I didn't turn on the radio because the silence felt earned. The divorce was finalized in 67 days. Deborah Price Whitman filed on the Monday after the dinner. Troy retained a new attorney. Gerald Doss had been suspended pending the Barr investigation, but the footage made negotiation almost impossible. His new lawyer, a man named Sutton Greer from a firm in Midtown, called Deborah's office on the third day and asked, using those exact words, what would it take for the recordings to never become public? Deborah told him, full custody to me. The house indicator, which was valued at $485,000. Child support of $3,200 per month. And a restraining order requiring Troy to complete a certified anger management program before any supervised visitation could begin. Troy agreed to everything in 9 days. He didn't fight. He couldn't. The camera he never found had recorded every version of him he'd spent years hiding. The man who had controlled every dollar, every decision, every exit, signed away his leverage in a conference room on Peachtree Street while his new lawyer looked at the floor. Gerald Doss lost his license 4 months later. The state bar's investigation confirmed he had participated in a strategy session with a non-client, Diane, to manufacture evidence against a custodial parent. His 40-year career ended because of a conversation he had on my living room couch while my son's drawings were taped to the refrigerator 10 feet away. Diane disappeared. I don't know where she went. I don't need to. Last I heard from Nadia, who keeps track of these things the way paralegals do, Diane had moved to somewhere in Florida. That felt right. People who live on the surface tend to end up in places with a lot of it. Lorene moved into the Decatur house with Beckett and me for 6 months while I transitioned. She cooked dinner every Tuesday, pot roast, green beans and biscuits from scratch. He helped Beckett with his homework. She taught him to play cards on the back porch. She read him stories from a book of Georgia folk tales she'd kept since Troy was a boy, a book Troy had thrown in a closet 20 years ago and forgotten. Lorene had pulled it out, smoothed the cover and kept it on the shelf next to Beckett's bed like it had always been there. One evening about 3 months after the divorce, Lorene and I were sitting on the back porch. Beckett was in the yard chasing fireflies. The air smelled like cut grass in the neighbor's grill. She looked at me and said, I should have spoken up sooner. I saw what he was becoming and I told myself it wasn't my place. I didn't tell her it was okay. It wasn't okay. But I reached over and held her hand, and we sat there watching Beckett run through the grass until the sky turned dark and the fireflies got so thick they looked like the yard was full of tiny moving stars. I'm now the executive director of the Literacy Foundation. I got the promotion 5 weeks after the divorce. My salary is $72,000, nearly double what I made when Troy used to call my job babysitting. I run programs in 9 counties across central Georgia. Last month, we opened a weekend reading lab at Pine Ridge Elementary, Beckett School. He volunteers there on Saturdays, sitting with the younger kids, helping them sound out words, holding the books open with both hands the way I taught him. He's 9 now. He draws houses with doors, windows, and a garden out front. Last week he added a mailbox. I still have the camera. It's in a drawer in my nightstand, next to my grandmother's pearl earrings and a folded piece of paper where Beckett wrote in his 3rd grade handwriting, Mom is brave. I didn't ask him to write it. He left it on my pillow one morning before school, tucked under the edge of my pillowcase like a secret he wanted me to find. Some nights, after Beckett is asleep, I sit on the back porch with a cup of tea and I listen to the crickets. I don't think about Troy. I don't think about Diane. I think about the woman who stood in that hallway holding a laundry basket and watching her son get hit and didn't scream, not because she was weak but because she was already planning. I think about how silence, when you choose it, is not the same as silence when it's forced on you. The house is quiet now. But it's a different kind of quiet. The kind that means safe. If you made it this far, you're my people. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to draw a line with your own family? What did it cost you? I read every single one.